Firstly, thank you everybody for coming to our third webinar. These are proving very popular and very successful. So hopefully this one will be popular and successful, Darren. No pressure. Darren is a fairly newcomer to Froglife, but he's certainly no newcomer to wildlife conservation. He worked for the RSPB for a number of years, managing 2 large nature reserves in Yorkshire. And before that, he worked for the Environment Agency. Darren is working for Froglife on the Yorkshire Tales of Amphibian Discovery project. Darren has always been fascinated by UK wildlife since he was a child, and he's passionate about addressing the declines in UK biodiversity and reconnecting people and communities with the natural world. Aside from reptiles and amphibians, Darren's other areas of expertise are birds, butterflies, and trapping moths in his garden, but he does let them go again. Darren has shown us some fascinating moth footage, but today he will be talking about another one of his passions. Over to you, Darren.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction, Kathy. No pressure at all then, since the other first 2 have gotten so well. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully that will work. Right, can we see that?
I can't, no.
No. Did work a minute ago.
It did, yes.
There you are, yes.
Is that better? Right, okay.
Thank you, Darren.
Right, okay. So this evening I want to talk about wildlife friendly gardening, and with particular reference to amphibians and reptiles. But obviously helping wildlife in your garden isn't exclusive just to them, and things that you do for amphibians and reptiles can be really helpful for all the other kinds of creatures too. And I think one of the key points that I want to try and get across this evening is that we can all do something to help wildlife in our own gardens, whether we've got a big garden, a small garden, a backyard, we live in a flat with a balcony. There's always something that we can do to help wildlife. So hopefully by the end of this evening, you'll know a little bit more about some of the things that you can potentially do to help wildlife in your garden. Although the talk is about amphibians and reptiles in general, I particularly want to start by just talking a little bit about this chap here. So this beautiful, in my eyes, charismatic, slightly grumpy looking creature is the common toad, or to give him his scientific name, Bufo bufo, which I think is a fantastic name. The unfortunate thing about the common toad is that the name is becoming increasingly inappropriate for them. So they are becoming increasingly less common, and the decline is actually quite a cause for alarm. So toads, in keeping with a lot of British wildlife, are in a lot of trouble. So their population has declined by around 65% over the last 30 years, which is really quite a dramatic decline. And if the decline continues at that current rate without any halt or any intervention from us, they could potentially be extinct as a species in the UK within the next decade, which is quite an alarming thought, really. So why are they struggling so much? There are a number of reasons for that. Habitat loss and particularly the loss of ponds and breeding sites, which we'll go into in a bit more detail, is a really important factor in the decline of their population. The fact that they, as you can see from the image there, the two amorous toads in the photograph, the male being the one on the top, they always attempt to return to the same ponds where they were bred every year to mate, and that can involve quite a hazardous journey, crossing roads. So toads will sort of utilise an area of up to 2 kilometres around the pond where they were bred. So every year they've potentially got a 2 kilometre journey to make back to their breeding pond, which, as the world becomes increasingly developed and urbanised, and there are more cars and more traffic on the road, more roads, it becomes an increasingly perilous adventure for them. Climate change is another factor in terms of particularly the reduction in sort of wetlands and also diseases. There are a number of diseases which can affect populations of toads and other amphibians as well. So that's quite a bleak picture and probably quite a dour way to start the presentation, but hopefully one of the messages, I didn't want to sugarcoat things and say, yeah, everything's great. Toads are in a lot of trouble, but we can all do something to help. So hopefully we can find out a little bit more about that. Why are we looking at, why are we talking about toads in the context of wildlife gardening? Toads are not really a garden animal, are they? Or are they? I don't know. Maybe they are. But toads, like all creatures, all they require to be successful and to thrive is somewhere to feed, somewhere to shelter, and somewhere to breed. And if we can provide them with those three factors, then they will do okay. Gardens in particular are a hugely important resource for a whole range of wildlife. Gardens in the UK actually cover more land area than all of the national nature reserves put together. So obviously most gardens are relatively small and individually can only have a relatively limited impact, but collectively gardens can make a huge difference to wildlife across the UK. Like I say, they actually cover more area than all of the nature reserves. Gardens are really important because they provide refuge for a lot of wildlife in urban areas. And like I said previously, the size of urban areas and conurbations is growing year upon year. So anywhere where we can offer refuge to wildlife in our increasingly urbanised society is a really important thing. And gardens also connect a lot of habitats, so they provide a chain of sort of a green corridor that can link other important habitats as well. So, and finally, a lot of gardens have been there for a long time. So as the world around them has changed dramatically over, say, the last 100 years, a lot of the houses and gardens have been there over that period and have remained unchanged. So they're a relatively stable environment for a whole range of animals in a world that's becoming increasingly hostile. So we're going to have a look at a typical garden, and we're going to just have a look throughout the year at various things that we can potentially do to improve our garden for wildlife and amphibians and reptiles in particular. So you'll see as the presentation goes on, this black and white garden will gradually take shape into what potentially is an extremely beneficial garden for a whole range of wildlife. If we're only going to do one thing as a result of this evening's webinar to help wildlife, if you haven't already, is if you can find some space in your garden to create a pond, that is a massively beneficial thing to do. Over 50% of the ponds in the UK have been lost over the last 50 years. And when you think that amphibians, so amphibians being frogs, toads and newts, all require 100% on water to complete their life cycle. If 50% of that habitat has been lost in the last 50 years, you can see why there's been potentially such a large decline in their numbers. And in fact, going back a little further in time, but in the overall scheme of things, 100 years is nothing. Over 90% of wetlands have been lost in the UK over that sort of time period. So anything that we can do to redress that decline and create a pond, and we'll talk a little bit more about what makes a good pond, but anything that we can do to address that decline is massively important. And as we become increasingly aware and hopefully concerned of issues around climate change, etc., and people become more aware of the importance of capturing carbon and carbon sequestration, it's become increasingly important that people appreciate that ponds and wetlands are a really important source of carbon capture. So even a relatively small, just your average size garden pond, can actually capture around 2 kilograms of organic carbon every year. So when people think about carbon capture, they naturally, I think, tend to think about planting trees, but actually creating ponds can have just as big if not more effect on carbon. But obviously, it's got a massive effect on helping amphibians and reptiles and other wildlife as well. So by saving amphibians, we can all collectively contribute to saving the planet as well. Now, I know my colleague a couple of weeks ago did a whole webinar on creating ponds, and I think some of you this evening who are here this evening may well have attended that webinar. So I'm not going to go into any great detail about pond construction. Suffice it, but I will point you in the direction of where to find more information. But a few key points I just wanted to get across with regards to ponds in your garden is that no pond is too small. Any pond is better than no pond. One of the important things to think about in terms of amphibians is that they need some way of getting in and out of the pond. So I see a lot of pictures of people who created ponds out of old Belfast sinks or washing up bowls, which are all great in their own right and will provide a home and a habitat for aquatic invertebrates, and dragonflies and damselflies will lay their eggs in it. But if a toad or a frog can't get in or out of the pond, then essentially it's of no use to them. Ponds generally that are quite shallow work better for amphibians than deeper ponds, and by shallow we're talking about sort of 30 to 45 centimetres at their deepest, and with nice shallow margins. Shallow water warms up much more quicker in the sunshine, and frogs in particular really like to lay their spawn in sort of quite shallow, warm water. Some element of shade is also important, either actually in the water or over the water. It just gives the animals somewhere to actually get out of the strongest of the sun. Plants are also really important, not just in terms of their providing food for tadpoles. So tadpoles are vegetarian in their early stages of their life cycle. They also provide a source of oxygenation for the water. But in the case of newts, which if you have a pond in your garden, there's every chance you will get smooth newts, particularly paying you a visit. So unlike frogs and toads who lay a clump or a string of spawn, the newts lay individual eggs, and every single egg is then wrapped in the leaf of the pond plant as protection. So if there are no plants in your pond, then you probably won't get newts visiting you to breed. So, and then the final consideration, as you can see from most of the pictures there, is that there's some degree of shelter or safety somewhere close to the pond. So a pile of rocks, a pile of logs, a rockery, somewhere where the amphibians can kind of retreat to and stay cool and damp and safe from predators. If you missed James's excellent presentation the other week, Froglife, we do produce an excellent free guide to creating a wildlife pond called Just Add Water. It is available from our website. You can download the PDF from the website. I do have a supply of the booklets if you would like one posting out to you. If you can leave your details in the chat, and we will post you one out. All we ask in return is that you send us a picture of your pond when you've created it. Everything you need to know about creating a pond is in that booklet, and I would urge you to get hold of a copy if you haven't already. So moving on from ponds, which, like I say, I can't stress enough the fact that if you could only do one thing, try and incorporate some water somewhere in the garden. There are lots of other things that we can do throughout the garden to encourage not just amphibians, but also things that will provide a source of food for amphibians and things which will help you in the garden in terms of providing free pest control. And you don't necessarily need to have a big garden. You can grow a lot of things that are really helpful to wildlife in small pots and planters and containers. There are also a lot of things that you can grow in your garden which are great for wildlife, which also provide you with a source of food as well. So just looking at that in a little more detail. So there are lots of creatures that we can encourage into our garden, which not only provide potentially a source of food for amphibians, but they also provide a really great service to the gardeners in terms of controlling things like aphids in particular and slugs. So there's a lot of plants which are really nice, fragrant, can be used in cooking. So things like borage and fennel and lavender and things, which are great at attracting hoverflies, ladybirds, which are all really prolific predators of things like aphids. There are lots of other plants that things you can plant in your garden, which are great for using in the kitchen, but are also a great source of distracting pests from other plants and things as well. So if you're wanting to grow tomatoes or carrots or beans or sprouts or brassicas or things which are regularly predated by aphids and caterpillars and things, growing things like mint and garlic chives and sage nasturtiums is a really good way of distracting predators from those food crops. And there are lots of things that we can encourage in our garden, particularly around sort of boundaries of gardens and hedgerows and things, which may not necessarily directly benefit amphibians, but are great for other wildlife as well. So things like brambles and elderberries provide a brilliant source of autumn, winter food for birds and for small mammals. And sunflowers as well, if you leave them unpicked and let the heads go over, again, they provide a brilliant source of food for a lot of creatures during the colder months of the year. So we're gradually starting to see our garden take shape now. So one of the things that a lot of people are very particular about is that they think a well looked after garden is a tidy garden, and they've got the grass cut to within a millimetre, and there are no weeds anywhere, and everything is looks perfect. Now that may be perfect on the eye, but it's not necessarily the best way to garden in terms of wildlife. So on the slide there, it says messy borders. Looking at the inset, I don't particularly think that looks messy. I think that actually looks really pleasing on the eye. So your more kind of cottage garden style borders, where you've got a range of different heights of plants and different types of plants all growing together, is much more beneficial for wildlife than just having a sort of monoculture of one kind of plant or one height of plant. One of the things that I did this year was, I think it was no mow May, but it ended up being July, I think, before I got the lawnmower out. But if you have got a lawn, if you can leave at least even small areas of it unmown, you'll be surprised what actually grows up there, and you may even get wildflowers and other things actually growing in the lawn. So a really nice thing to do is if you've got an area of lawn where you can just sort of mow a path through it and leave the rest to nature. So grass doesn't keep growing forever. All of our grasses that we have in our lawns only grow to a certain height. So they will, most of them between sort of 1 and 2 feet, depending on the species of plant. So you're not going to end up with a jungle that you're not going to be able to walk through, but having areas of longer grass and allowing some of the wildflowers a chance to actually develop and flower is a great thing to do. So just sort of reiterating some of those points. I mean, I think those borders and those gardens look really beautiful, but they're not sort of how most people would particularly think that garden was well looked after. Some people would think that's a bit messy or a bit unkempt, but in terms of wildlife, it's a really great garden. So think about the grass. Give yourself a few weeks off during the summer. Leave the grass uncut. Think about wildflowers. Wildflower seeds, native wildflower seeds, are a great source of adding colour to the garden, but also providing source of food for lots of pollinating insects. They also provide great cut flowers. You can put through in the house. Be careful when you're cutting the grass and strimming, particularly in the sort of May to June period, when potentially there will be small froglets and things coming out of the pond that you've built in the garden. So if you can avoid cutting grass, particularly around the edges of ponds at that time of year, then that's a really good thing to do. So just want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned it already, but what we call natural pest control. So, like I said, there are a lot of plants that are really great at attracting pollinating species. So things like bees and butterflies are all suffering, or a lot of them are suffering quite serious declines in numbers. And any sort of plants that provide them with a source of nectar is a really beneficial thing to have. But they are also really good at controlling other kinds of pests in the garden as well. Hedges are a fantastic wildlife resource. Not only do potentially some of them provide berries in the winter, but a lot of them, so your hawthorn and your blackthorn and things, have a great display of flowers and provide nectar for insects in the spring. And they also, if it's a sort of dense hedge, can provide cover and shelter for amphibians as well. Try and avoid pruning hedges during the bird breeding season, if possible. So generally, if you can avoid the period from sort of late March up to late July, that should ensure that any birds that are nesting in the hedges in your garden do so undisturbed. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about the three things that amphibians and reptiles and other wild creatures require to thrive. One of them being a source of somewhere to feed, one of them being somewhere to breed. So we've got our pond, so they've got somewhere to breed. We've created a great mixed border of wildflowers and herbs that's attracting lots of insects, and so that's providing food for amphibians and lots of other creatures. There's also a lot of things that we can do to provide amphibians and reptiles somewhere to shelter, and particularly during the winter to see out the colder, harsher months. So we've got a few things on our imaginary garden here. So most people will have come across and heard of bug hotels. Great fun to make, brilliant activity for children to get involved with, and they are really good at providing homes for lots of insects in particular, so things like solitary bees and mason bees and other invertebrates. Hedgehogs, I know we're an amphibian and reptile charity, but we do care about all wildlife here at Froglife, and hedgehogs are another native creature whose numbers are in huge decline. And hedgehog houses, you can buy them, but equally you can have just as much fun making one yourself. But just something as simple as a pile of logs in a quiet corner of the garden, or it makes a great home and shelter for frogs, toads, newts, hedgehogs, small mammals, lots of insects and other invertebrates. And then we've got something on there called a hibernaculum, which sounds really, really grand, but it isn't really. It's essentially an amalgamation of all of those other three things. So it provides a great home for amphibians, reptiles, bugs, small mammals, hedgehogs, etc. And it is, well, obviously it's a Latin word, but it's basically somewhere for them to hibernate. So we'll just look at that in a little bit more detail. So hibernacular you can create in a couple of different ways depending on what the ground conditions are like in your garden. If your garden's relatively free draining and dry, the ideal way to do it is to dig a small scrape or hollow in the garden, and you can then fill that with stones, rubble, logs, branches, twigs, and then basically the material that you've excavated to create the hollow. Once you've filled it up with the material, you then put the topsoil back on top again. You can put small drainage pipes or bits of old roof drainage pipes, down pipes and things like that, or even small plastic tubes, and have those to create sort of access points into the hibernaculum. But to be honest, the creatures will find their own way in there. If you have a garden that's where the soil is prone to clayey soils, wet, waterlogged gardens, what you don't want to be doing is digging a hole in the ground and creating a puddle. So if you're going to create a hibernaculum in wet soils, you need to actually pile the material up above ground level, exactly the same process, but just do it above ground level, so you end up with a nice little mound, which it still provides exactly the same habitat and shelter. Log piles, as I mentioned, are great. try and put them in a shady area of the garden. So a little damp corner, if you've got one in your garden, is a fantastic place for a log pile. Bug hotels, I won't talk too much about. There's lots of information about those, but there are even things just as simple as if you've got any old broken plant pots, just leave one of those upturned in the corner of the garden. Makes a perfect place for a toad to spend the winter. Other things such as metal sheets or bits of old carpet tile, again, make fantastic places for amphibians and particularly reptiles to shelter under, as they sort of absorb the warmth of the sun, and that gets passed on to the animals. So there are lots and lots of things that you can do, not necessarily taking up a lot of room in your garden. You can, even in a relatively small space, there are a lot of things that you can do to provide amphibians and other creatures with the vital shelter that they require to see them through the colder months of the year. Another thing that is very beneficial for a lot of creatures, if you have space for in your garden, is a compost heap. Now, a lot of garden centres will sell compost bins. I think a lot of local authorities actually gave away or sold compost bins at a reduced rate in a way to encourage householders to minimise the amount of green waste that they were throwing out. From an environmental point of view, in terms of creating good compost and reducing the amount of green waste that we throw away, sealed plastic compost bins work really well. As a resource for wildlife, they're really, really quite poor indeed. So if you can find space in your garden for an open compost heap, like some of the ones you can see in the pictures here, so much better for a whole range of wildlife. Ideally, you want a sunny location. So if you can have it facing south, that's the perfect location for a compost heap. Some sort of open construction. A lot of people I've seen use old pallets as a really effective basis to make the compost heap from. And yeah, you can just use the compost heap for your gardening waste, leaves, grass, etc. If you can, ideally, if you can cover it over, various things work really well, such as a bit of old carpet or a tarpaulin or even a metal tin. Compost heaps are fantastic for a whole range of wildlife, but for amphibians and reptiles in particular. As the material in the compost heap breaks down, as it decomposes, it actually produces heat. So the compost heap will be the warmest place in your garden in the winter, and lots of animals take advantage of that. Compost heaps are also absolutely teeming with invertebrate life, which is a great source of food for frogs and toads and newts and lots of other things as well. And if you're really lucky, the grass snake, which is one of our only reptiles that actually lays eggs, their absolute favourite place to lay their eggs is actually in compost heaps. So again, taking advantage of the warmth that is created as the material breaks down in the compost heap. So if you have got room to accommodate a compost heap in your garden, great thing to do for amphibians and reptiles, but a whole range of other wildlife as well. Some of the other things that we can do as autumn and winter starts approaching, we can put up bird boxes and bat boxes. Another simple, cheap and potentially handmade way of helping wildlife. It's a great activity to get children involved in making bird boxes, etc. And there's nothing more exciting than seeing a family of blue tits fledging from a nest box that you've made and put up in your own garden. One thing to be mindful of in autumn and winter is if you are doing repairs to your garden, Well, all amphibians and reptiles, but newts in particular like to sort of hide themselves away in cracks and crannies between rocks, and if you've got paths and patios and things like that that you're looking to clean or repair or etc., just make sure that there aren't any creatures hibernating in there before you start repairing them. Gaps in fences is another really important thing for a whole range of wildlife. I mentioned, and when I say gaps in fences, I'm talking about leaving or creating gaps in fences, not repairing them. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about what an amazing resource collectively gardens are for wildlife. But they're only as good as the sum of their parts, in terms of, if you could have the best garden in the world and incorporate all of the things that we just talked about, and have an amazing pond and a compost heap, but if there's no way that a frog or a toad or a newt can get into your garden, then essentially what you've created isn't available for them to use. So birds and insects in general can fly, so they can find their way into a lot more places. But frogs and toads in particular, they're not particularly mobile. They're not like frogs with big long legs, and they can hop big distances quite over quite high things. So if you do have a fence around your garden, just have a look at it and think, well, if I was a toad or a hedgehog, is there some way I could get through that fence? So just even having a small gap at the bottom of the fence somewhere in the garden, the creatures will find it and will be able to use the fantastic habitat that you've created. Obviously feed the birds. There's something that a lot of people do, but it's a great way of encouraging wildlife into your garden, and another really important way of engaging children and getting them interested in nature. You know, seeing birds in the garden at such close hand. And another really important thing that I want to just talk about now is what we call citizen science. So I mentioned the huge decline in the population of toads over the last sort of 35 years. Well, how do we know that their population has declined so dramatically over that period? A lot of that data is down to you, to individuals recording wildlife in their local areas, in their gardens. So Froglife or any other conservation organisation don't have the resources to go around and survey everybody's garden and see whether you've got frogs or newts or toads in your garden. But everyone individually can do that, and then the collective sum of that data provides us with all the information that helps inform conservation decisions, government policy, and everything else. So the more people that can get involved in recording what nature is actually in, or equally importantly, what nature isn't around anymore, provides an invaluable resource and source of data that conservationists can use to try and influence government and decision makers. So, in order to help you achieve that, we have our very own app, which is available free of charge. It's available in both Android and iOS, and it is called Dragon Finder. It's brilliant, and it's, as well as being a really important way of you personally recording any sightings of any amphibians or reptiles, it's also a lot of fun as well. It will help you identify anything that you see. It has all the different sounds of all the different creatures on as well, so the kids really enjoy it. So even just this, simple things of identifying, is that frog or is it a toad? Which incidentally, that's quite an unusual picture there of a frog and the toad next to each other. So the toad is the one on the left and the frog is the one on the right. So superficially similar, but equally also quite different. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the differences shortly. But so another takeaway message from this evening, really important, an action that everybody can do, well, assuming that you have a smartphone, is everyone can download the app and everybody can record, submit the sightings, whether they're in your own garden or whether when you're out and about in the general countryside, if you see frogs, toads, newts, if you're lucky and you see snakes or lizards, or you see tadpoles or frog spawn, just go onto the app, 2 or 3 clicks, and it's recorded. We've got that information, and it's really, really important. So there are only 13 native species of amphibian and reptile in the UK, but some of them are quite rare and are quite specialised in their habitat requirements. So things like sand lizards and smooth snakes and natterjack toads, you are extremely unlikely to ever see in a garden unless you happen to have a garden that backs onto a sand dune or something. But there are a number of our native amphibians and reptiles that you will encounter in gardens. So the toad and the frog are 2 of them. You can see the differences in the pictures there, and again the app is a great way of identifying them. But in general, toads have a sort of warty, dry looking skin. They love compost heaps, so they only really go into water to actually to lay the spawn, and once that's done, they don't tend to spend very much time in ponds, but they love compost heaps, log piles, piles of rocks. The frog has a sort of smoother, more shiny, moister skin, and they do tend to spend more time in and around ponds, but they don't live in the ponds all year round. So if you have a pond in your garden, you're very likely to encounter one or both of those. 2 creatures that look superficially quite similar but are in fact very different are the newt and the lizard. And if you have a pond in your garden, there's every chance you will get smooth newts paying you a visit. So newts spend quite a bit of time in the water, but they do come out of water, particularly during the winter, to find somewhere safe to hibernate. Lizards never go in the water, so they're a creature. So newts are an amphibian, lizards are a reptile. So lizards spend all their time on dry land, and they love things like piles of rocks or dry areas where they can bask in the sun. So like all reptiles, they're cold-blooded animals, so they rely on the warmth of the sun and to give them enough energy to actually become active. If you're really lucky, you might see a grass snake. Beautiful animal, which although some people are scared of snakes, it really is nothing to be scared of. They are not venomous, and like I said, they do love a nice compost heap in which to lay their eggs. And then another creature which is actually quite widespread but very seldom seen because they are quite secretive, and despite the name, slow worm, are actually quite quick. So the slow worm, although it's called a worm and looks like a snake, is actually a lizard. So they are actually a form of legless lizard. They are quite widespread, particularly in the southern part of the UK. If you do want to try and see whether you've got slow worms in your garden, if you could get a couple of old carpet tiles and put them somewhere quiet and shady in the garden, and then every so often just turn the corner over and have a look underneath. If there are slow worms around, then there's every chance that you'll see one under there. So I've talked quite a while there about some of the things that you can do in your garden, and a lot of it is quite, some of the statistics I think are quite scary and quite worrying. But it isn't just amphibians and reptiles. It's a lot of UK wildlife is under serious threat from the same issues that affects our amphibians. So, inappropriate development, draining of wetlands, construction of new roads and housing, increasingly intensified, agricultural land use, etc. But it isn't too late, and there is things that we can all do, irrespective of where we live and what kind of garden we have, or if indeed whether we have a garden or not. And there are a lot of organisations like Froglife who are out there to help and support you, and there is so much information these days available to help people to manage their own land in a way that's sensitive and helpful towards wildlife. So I would particularly point you towards the Froglife website. There is a section on there particularly aimed at wildlife gardening, but there is lots and lots of other information on there. When I first started, as Kathy mentioned, I've only worked with Froglife since March of this year, and I found it a hugely helpful source of information. Any question that you've got about a frog or a new or a snake, the chances are the answers will be on the Froglife website. I mentioned earlier about how one of the things that really has affected toads badly is the increasing urbanisation, the number of roads, and the increased number of traffic on our roads. Even if you don't have a garden, one thing that you can do to help toads and other amphibians is to become a toad patroller. So again, the details are all on the website. But so there are around 450 active toad patrols in the UK, and we have about 3,000 volunteers who help us with those. And from the data that we collected last year, those 3,000 volunteers at those 450 toad patrols saved around 100,000 amphibians. The majority of those were toads, but also frogs and newts as well. Another great source of information and keeping in touch with what's going on and what we're doing, what great work we're doing across the country is through social media. Our Facebook page, we have around 12,000 followers. Megan has asked me to particularly mention Instagram because we're a handful of people short of 4,000 followers on Instagram. So if you don't already follow us at Froglifers, if you can do that this evening and get us over the 4,000 barrier, that'd be great. So we can all do our bit. So you might, at the end of the day, you might not end up with having a garden that looks like that because your garden may not be big enough. You might not like all of those things. You may only have a backyard. You might live in a flat with a balcony. But doesn't matter where you live and how big your garden or your outdoor space is, there's something that we can all do to help wildlife, and there's never been a more important time to do that. So hopefully, as a result of what you've heard this evening, you might feel a little more inspired to do some more to help wildlife in your local environment. I think we've now got time, we've got plenty of time for questions. So the link there again to the wildlife gardening section of our website is there. You can also contact me directly, that's my email address. I'm happy for anybody to contact me if they've got any questions or they think of something after they've gone this evening and they thought, oh, I wish I'd asked that. Then please contact me. I'm happy to respond. So I think I will hand you back to Kathy. Is that right, Kathy?
Yeah. If you can stop sharing your screen, please, Darren. Okay, great. Thanks, Darren, for another great presentation. And I think there's been lots in there for all of us to learn. And I've learned some things. And I only live in a flat with a balcony, but I do have a few plants. And I do notice lots of flying insects that actually seem to prefer to be inside my flat than on the plants, but that's fine. We live happily together. But anyway, so yeah, as Darren said, there is lots there for everybody to do. So I think, Darren, you've got some questions that have been sent in beforehand. And then if you could place your questions maybe in the chat box, that might be the easiest way for us to manage any additional questions that we've got. So the floor is open to you guys.
Hi everyone, I think we'll kick off with a few questions that were asked earlier before the webinar. Mitzi is asking, well, they have a pond where continually leaks. What is your advice on making it into a bog garden?
So a bog garden itself is a great resource for wildlife, but obviously it's not hugely beneficial to amphibians because they need something that's going to retain water throughout their breeding season, which in the UK is generally from kind of middle of February to end of June generally. So if you were thinking of converting the pond into a bog garden, if you could try and create another pond somewhere close by, that would be great. Like we said earlier, a pond doesn't need to be very big to be beneficial to wildlife. Megan and I visited some allotments in York a few weeks ago, and there was a lady there that had created a pond, and it was only probably about 1 metre by half a metre, and it was absolutely full of tiny little newts, or efts as they're called. You know, even relatively small ponds can be hugely beneficial. So if you're going to change your pond to a bog garden, that's great, but try and keep it an actual pond somewhere in the garden.
Great. Louise has a couple of questions. Louise is also asking about pond maintenance, and she has a pond with a pre-formed liner, and she wants to know what time of year is best to add a traditional liner. She still has many froglets living in the pond, and she wants them to have an easier exit.
Yeah, so that's interesting that she's still got froglets in the pond. That's actually getting quite late in the year now. But so frogs, well, all of the life cycles of amphibians and reptiles are really, really fascinating. But frogs in particular have got a couple of really cool tricks up their sleeve that help them adapt to sort of changes in their water environment. So as if the tadpoles are in a pond and the water starts to dry up, they can actually speed up their metamorphosis to go through the process of change to an adult frog more quickly. How they do that and how they know the pond is drying up, I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody does. But another thing that they do, which we found on a pond we looked at the other week, which is actually fed by a groundwater spring, is that particularly in the north of the country, where the water's colder, the frogs can actually the tadpoles delay their development, so they can actually overwinter as a tadpole and then complete their metamorphosis the following spring. So if anybody has still got tadpoles in their pond now, the chances are they're not going to complete their life cycle this year. So if you've still got tadpoles or froglets in your pond now, I wouldn't do anything with the pond this year. But generally, most of the amphibians will have completed their life cycle, and the small adults will have left the pond by sort of June time. So if you are looking to do any maintenance on a pond, sort of August, September, October onwards, it's normally fairly safe. But if you can leave it into October, Because newts in particular like to spend quite a bit longer time in the pond. So winter time is the time to sort of do maintenance on your pond. I think does that answer the question that she asked, I think?
I think it does, yeah, great
Yeah.
stuff. Louise also is asking, what is the best time to trim her hedge? She has a laurel hedge and birds use it for sheltering in the winter and for nesting.
Yeah, so we did talk about that briefly, but yeah, so if you can avoid cutting, pruning, or doing anything with your hedge during the bird breeding season, which varies from species to species, but the earliest ones tend to start in around March and be finished by around August. The only exceptions to that are wood pigeons and collared doves, which seem to have seem increasingly, I don't know whether it's climate change or not, but seem to just nest all year round. So if you see pigeons or doves flying in and out of your hedge, irrespective of what time of year it is, the chances are that they may be nesting in there, so don't do anything with it. If it's birds that are just using the hedge to roost in, then if you're trimming it or pruning it during the daytime, that's not going to affect them unduly. So just keep an eye out for the pigeons, but other than that, just during the winter is fine.
Great advice. I think we'll have one more question that was sent early because I can see some appearing in the chat. Joe is asking, what impact would his compost bin have on his pond, as his garden's quite small, they are quite close together?
Right, that's a really interesting question. So, so a compost heap, as the organic material that is in the compost heap decomposes and breaks down, it does produce compost, but it does also produce liquid as well, which people do actually collect it because it's really high in nutrients, in nitrogen and phosphate, and they use it to feed their plants with. So you might be familiar with the stuff you get, the brown stuff you get in little bottles called, is it Baby Bio or something like that, that people feed their plants with. It's very similar to that. So, but if your compost heap is right next to your pond, if that stuff is draining into the pond, it could potentially damage the pond by putting too many nutrients in the water, and you'd end up with lots of algae and things. So if you can have the compost heap sited slightly away from the pond, that would be better. As long as it's a few feet away, that should be fine. As long as it's not literally right next to the edge of the pond, it shouldn't cause too many problems.
Right, there is a question in the chat. I think Kathy is starting to answer. She's put now, they just had water booklet that gives loads of good advice in pond plant recommendations. Jasmine is asking about marginal pond plants and what species would you recommend? She currently has white forget-me-not around the edge of her pond, but is worried that it might become invasive and some of it might not be native.
Yeah, so the booklet, Just Add Water, does have a whole section in terms of what plants to introduce into your pond. So yeah, try and use native plants where possible. If you're starting creating a pond from scratch, most good garden centres will that have an aquatic section will these days increasingly only stock native plants, but do check, because there are a number of non-native aquatic plants which are sold for people to put in their garden ponds, and then have found their way into the wider countryside and do create some quite big problems. So things like floating pennywort and water hyacinth and crassula and things like that are becoming quite a big problem. So generally speaking, plants that provide some degree of oxygenation for the water are really good. If you're looking to attract newts, you want plants that have got small leaves. So things like water forget-me-not is a great plant for newts. Water mint is another great plant for newts. And then plants that provide some shade on the water. So things like water lilies as well are a great introduction the pond because they provide shade underneath. Does that answer the question?
There's lots of different ideas there, and if anyone does want more, there's everything in Just Add Water. So I think that's it for questions in the chat. I have got a couple here sent earlier, but if you do think of any, do keep popping them in the chat. Pat is asking, when is the best time to look for amphibians in her garden?
Right, okay. So if you have a garden that incorporates some or all of the elements that we've talked about, the chances are you will have amphibians in your garden all year round. But the best time to actually try and find them is when they're during the breeding season, essentially. So frogs and toads are both quite vocal during the breeding season, so the males are. And if you download the Dragon Finder app, it has all the different sounds that frogs and toads and other amphibians make. So that's a really good thing to listen out for. Sort of mild evenings in kind of mid-March onwards. And also that's the time of year when all of the amphibians will be thinking about returning to the pond to breed. So you can look for frog spawn and toad spawn in the pond. So again, all of this stuff is covered on Dragon Finder, but frog spawn is sort of laid in big clumps around the size of, I'm going to say, a cricket ball, but maybe a bit bigger. And each one of those individual clumps has actually been laid by one individual female frog. So you can actually tell by looking at how many clumps of frog spawn you've got, how many frogs you've got in your pond. Toads tend to lay a long strand of spawn, and it does sink to the bottom of the pond quite quickly, so that's more difficult to see. Newts, all species of newt have a really fantastic mating ritual where they perform really intricate dances, and the males grow great big crests along their back and get really bright colours under their belly, and they dance around to attract females, and they do that at night. So if you have a pond in your garden, if you go down to the pond during the hours of darkness and shine a torch into the water, if there are newts around, the chances are they will be active, and if you're really lucky, you might be able to see them performing one of their mating dances, which is really something quite special to see. So so they will be around all year, but during the autumn and the winter and the summer, they're likely to be spending the day hiding under the log pile that you've created, or in your hibernaculum, or in your pile of rocks. The best time to actually see them and know that they're actually there is during the sort of early part of the spring when they're going to be breeding.
Nice. That links quite nicely with Tegan's question. Tegan says she has a lot of frogs in the pond and they appear to mate, but no frog spawn has appeared for at least 5 years. Any idea why?
So there could be a number of reasons behind that. So I mean, if the frogs are present and they appear to be mating, the chances are that frog spawn is being produced. But then if, was it Tegan, was it?
Yeah.
If she's not actually seeing the frog spawn, it might be, I don't know how murky or otherwise the water is, because if it does sort of sink in the water a little bit, you may not see it, but then equally you would probably, potentially think that you would see tadpoles at some point. So there's possibly the chance that the frog spawn is being eaten by something. So quite a few birds in particular will eat frog spawn. So ducks are quite partial to frog spawn, and certain sort of crows and things like that will eat it as well. So it might be that's the reason, or it might just be that that perhaps that particular year, you know, it was a poor breeding season, and there wasn't very much frog spawn. But if the frogs are there and they look to be breeding, it may well be that there are tadpoles there that are just not getting seen, or it might be that they're actually being predated by something. So I don't know whether Tegan gets ducks on her pond, or whether it's big enough, or whether she gets.
No, there's no ducks.
Oh, right, okay. Do you see anything else in the garden that might be responsible for eating the frog spawn? Or?
No, I mean, occasionally there's a heron, but I tend to go out there most nights and
Yeah.
there's nothing around, but our neighbours get frog spawn.
Right. That's an
Have you got
unusual
fish
one.
in a pond?
No fish anymore, no.
And have you got newts? Because sometimes they eat them
Yes,
all as
lots
well.
of newts.
Oh, there's your answer.
Right, that may be it then. So so adult newts are quite prolific consumers of frog spawn. So so that may well be the answer.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, our species like to eat each other.
Yeah. So grass snakes love to eat frogs. As another example. So.
But it's good to have newts.
Perhaps create another pond for the frogs, and the newts can maybe live side by side, gives the amphibs a chance.
Yep.
So there's lots of questions just coming up in the chat. Caroline is asking, do rats eat amphibians, and how does one discourage them from a high vernacular?
So the answer to that in simplistically is potentially yes, they would, and there isn't really any way you can discourage them. So I mean, rats will find their way pretty much anywhere they want to get. So they don't eat toads. So very little actually will eat a toad because of their warty skin. Actually secretes a really sort of foul tasting toxin that other animals find really distasteful. So very few things actually eat toads, although I am informed that apparently otters do eat toads, but they've learned that if they peel the skin off them first before they eat them, then they're okay. So no, I mean, rats are, whether you like them or not, are part of our wildlife, and we just need to learn to live with them, really. So there isn't really anything that you could do to deter a rat from a hibernaculum, I'm afraid.
A very interesting question from Rhiannon, sorry. So you talked about slugs being pests, and I guess because they cause damage to plants and crops. Do frogs and toads eat slugs, and should they be discouraged?
Yeah, so, well, apologies if I didn't mention that during the presentation, but yeah, that's a really important point. So I did talk about, I think I talked about natural pest control, but frogs and toads in particular love to eat slugs. So if you have a problem with slugs, then toads and hedgehogs are your best friends. So and the more that people can use natural forms of pest control rather than going down the route of using chemicals and slug pellets and things, the better. But yeah, toads in particular eat an awful lot of slugs.
Definitely. Mark has just commented that the frogs in his big pond were stopped spawning, and the newts ate the spawn, but he built a second, shallower, smaller pond, and the frogs is at the spawning. So that proves that even a small pond is fantastic for wildlife.
Brilliant. Well, there's Tegan's answer. Then you need to create another small pond just for the frogs and leave the newts in the big one.
Yes, that is all the questions I have got. If anyone does have any more, do pop them in and we'll answer them.
I think, thank you everyone for attending. Any further questions we'll take from the chat box and Darren will respond by email. Just another reminder that if you become a Froglife friend, you can attend all these wonderful webinars free of charge. Otherwise, we do levy a small fee for administration costs. And finally, a huge thank you to Darren, Megan and Ash, who have gone to enormous efforts to put this webinar together. And also a huge thanks to our previous teams who have put on the other two webinars. Darren, you did live up to the reputation, so you're absolutely fine. We'll keep you for the time being.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone and have a lovely evening and thank you for attending. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.